You know, for literally thousands of years, there's been this hidden world locked away in a deep freeze, right under our feet. But now, as our planet gets warmer, this ancient frozen ground is starting to thaw, and it's unearthing secrets that have been buried since the last ice age.
And the place where this is all happening fastest? It's the Arctic. This intense warming isn't just melting the ice you see on the surface, it's going deep into the ground, waking up a world that's been frozen solid for an incredible amount of time.
And that leads us to the big question we're tackling today, because we're not just talking about boring old rock and ice here. We're talking about a microscopic world kept in perfect cold storage that's now being exposed to our modern world for the very first time.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll explore what this ancient freezer really is. Then, we're going to look at some pretty wild giant viruses scientists are waking up in their labs. After that, we'll decode the real risks, look at a serious warning out of Siberia, and tie it all into the bigger climate picture. And finally, we'll wrap up with the path forward, which is all about research, not panic.
Okay, first up, Earth's ancient freezer. Now, it's super easy to just think of permafrost as, frozen dirt, but it's way, way more interesting than that. Think of it more like a giant frozen archive holding on to pieces of our planet's distant past.
The textbook definition is actually pretty straightforward. It's any ground that stays frozen for at least 2 years in a row. But the scale of it, whoa, it's just staggering. We're talking about almost a quarter of all the land in the northern hemisphere, some of which has been frozen solid since the time of the Neanderthals.
And that is exactly why this whole thing is such a big deal. The constant, deep freeze temperatures create the perfect conditions for preservation. Everything from bits of woolly mammoth and ancient pollen to, you guessed it, bacteria and viruses can all be locked away, totally dormant and unchanged, for tens of thousands of years. So you can probably guess what scientists did next, right? They've been drilling down, taking samples of this permafrost, and bringing them back to the lab to see if anything in there is, well, still alive. And what they've found is pretty mind-blowing. Get this. In a pretty recent study, researchers actually managed to revive a virus that was dormant in Siberian permafrost for over 48,000 years. Just let that sink in for a second. This thing was frozen long before the last woolly mammoths died out, and now it's active again in a lab.
Okay, but before you start panicking, let's be super clear about what these things actually are. The viruses being brought back to life are called giant viruses, because they're huge for a virus. And, here's the most important part, their target is really specific. They infect amoebas. You know those little single-celled blobs? They have absolutely no interest in humans.
And the researchers themselves are really hammering this point home. This quote from one of their main papers says it all. Reviving these specific viruses is a totally safe way to prove that long-term survival is possible without creating any risk to people. So the big takeaway here is this. It's a proof of concept. It's not the start of a pandemic.
All right, so if these giant viruses that grab all the headlines aren't the real threat, then what is? What should we actually be concerned about? Well, for scientists, the worry is less about a single zombie virus and more about a whole bunch of complex changes all happening at once in the Arctic.
They're really looking at this problem from a few different angles. First, there's just the massive release of all this old biological stuff. Second, you have animal carcasses and even old burial sites being exposed, which could be hiding grounds for pathogens we already know about. Third, the entire microscopic ecosystem in the soil is changing. And finally, as the Arctic opens up, more people are moving in for things like mining and drilling, putting them in direct contact with this thawing environment.
And look, this isn't just some theory cooked up in a lab. We actually have a real-world case study that shows how this can have some very serious consequences. We need to talk about a warning from Siberia.
Let's go back to 2016 on the Yamal Peninsula. An anthrax outbreak just pops up. Here's how it happened. Decades ago, infected reindeer were buried in the frozen ground. Then, in 2007, the local reindeer herd stopped getting their routine vaccinations. Fast forward to a crazy hot summer in 2016, the ground thaws deeper than usual, and suddenly anthrax is back. It led to a terrible loss of life, for both animals and for people.
But here's where it gets really interesting. A scientific debate kicked off almost immediately. Was this a clear case of an ancient disease coming back from the dead? Or was the story a little more complicated?
So you've got two main camps here. Theory one is the one you probably heard about. The heat wave thawed old reindeer graves and released ancient anthrax spores. Theory 2 is that anthrax might have just been hanging around in the soil all along, and the outbreak could have happened anyway. But here's something everyone agrees on. The reindeer herds were incredibly vulnerable. Because vaccination had stopped, they had no immunity, and that's what allowed the disease to spread like wildfire.
So yeah, the anthrax outbreak was a localized disaster, but it's also kind of like the canary in the coal mine for a much bigger global issue that ties right back into climate change. I'm talking about a climate feedback loop.
To really get a handle on the stakes here, check out this number. Permafrost soils are holding on to about 1 trillion metric tons of carbon. That is more than double the amount of carbon that's in our entire atmosphere right now.
And this is where you see this dangerous cycle kick in. The permafrost thaws, then the microbes that were frozen wake up and start eating all that old organic stuff. As they do, they release tons of CO2 and methane. Those greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere even more, which, you guessed it, causes more permafrost to thaw. It's a cycle that just feeds on itself.
So after all that, ancient viruses, anthrax, a carbon bomb, what's the takeaway? How are we supposed to react? Well, the scientific community is pretty united on this. The right response is research, not panic. It's all about taking a calm, evidence-based look at what's next.
This chart right here does a great job of putting things into perspective. The risk from some unknown ancient virus coming out of the permafrost is, well, it's pretty low. And honestly, we just don't know. It's a question mark. But the risk from modern diseases jumping from animals to people, so-called zoonotic spillover, we know that's a huge deal. It's a high and very well-known threat we're dealing with constantly.
So let's just boil it all down. Here's what we need to remember. What we know: ancient microbes can survive being frozen for a very long time. What we don't know, if any of them are actually a real threat to us out in the wild. And so what we must do is pretty clear. We need to keep a close eye on the Arctic, fund more research, and most importantly, tackle the root cause of all this: climate change.
And that's why all the zombie virus talk you see in the headlines can actually be pretty damaging. It makes for a cool movie plot, sure, but it's a distraction from the much more real and immediate dangers of a warming Arctic, like collapsing ecosystems and the spread of modern diseases we already know about. So in the end, the thawing permafrost leaves us with a pretty deep question, doesn't it? It's literally unlocking our planet's past, and it's a direct result of our planet's present. As we keep uncovering these ancient secrets, we really have to ask ourselves, are we ready for what we might find? And maybe more importantly, are we ready for the future that we ourselves are creating?